Now we're moving to some sculpture. And in this case, we're starting with the Death of the Virgin. And this is in Strasbourg, in the German Rhineland. And here what we're seeing is an area where the Ottonian emperors are still ruling. In the church itself, we have an apse, choir, and transepts that are still Romanesque. But the reliefs of two of the south transept portals are fully Gothic. In this case, this is the left tympanum, in which we see the death of the Virgin Mary. And it's a very interesting piece of sculpture. In this case, they're using the ark to create sort of this idea of an ark of mourners around around the Virgin dying here in front. And the Virgin, you'll note, is fairly proportional and well laid out. And the figures, when you look at some of them individually, they work, but what they run into here is the same problem we had in Greece when we dealt with pediment sculpture. So at the edges, here and here, we need smaller figures, which we get. We have this gentleman who's very, very short, compared to this gentleman who is a good 2 feet taller, incredibly large. The heights are adjusted to fit within the space. And it also gets awkward because you'll notice all of these figures behind, but yet under the bed there are no feet. So these figures apparently are floating or standing on a choir rise. Some of the figures, Christ here is receiving his mother's soul, and that's what we're seeing him hold there, although it looks very small and doll-like. And Mary Magdalene crouches in front with the Virgin. The figures are very expressive of the sorrow they feel from Mary's death, and very widely, with very deeply cut clothing or drapery. And it gets a little bit more interesting. So with this extra, sort of this caricature-like effect that we see here, what they're trying to do is show human emotions and stir responses. However, they're not able to do it in a really naturalistic form like we saw with the Hellenistic Greeks. And it gets a little awkward at times. So we have figures that are clearly mourning, but oftentimes they come off as deadpan or with unusual expressions of mourning, such as this hand. But don't worry, it gets a little odder. Because of the way it's laid out, it's not always thought out really well. So here we're okay, but suddenly we have this guy right here who looks all right. He's sort of looking at someone's back, but he also appears to be holding the head of the person next to him, not necessarily attached to a body. Very unusual. We have these figures, originally they would have been painted, and they might have been more lifelike, but this is really an attempt to get across emotion when you don't understand the depiction of emotion because you haven't developed the depiction of the body entirely yet. It's sort of one artist getting ahead of themselves in this case. But don't worry, it gets a little stranger. Because next we have the Virgin Pieta. And this is a painted wood sculpture that looks like this. I'm just going to let this sink in for a minute. So this is meant to have an expressive exaggeration. The heads are unusually large, and that's intentional to help get across the emotion of the moment. A Pieta is the moment where Christ's body is taken off the cross and handed to his mother, the Virgin Mary, and she would have been, mourning his death at that point. Here, the body of Jesus is stiffened in death. We get that sense of rigor mortis. The wounds, which we see on the hands and feet, seem to be gushing blood. And the Virgin cradles him almost as if he were actually a smaller child who happens to be in a 33-year-old body. The oversized face is showing us a sense of anguish. We don't have any of the serenity of the Romanesque of Mary. Nor is it aloof like the Byzantine images. Instead, we just get this very haunting image of her and Jesus. And here we're looking at the faces up close, and this is probably the best rendering of a woman in anguish that we've seen in quite some time, probably going back to the Romans. And she has that look that we read as anguish. And it seems subtle, but that's important because if it's not subtle, it comes off as a caricature. So that's going to be an important aspect of this. Jesus, when we look at him, is clearly dead, having just suffered. We see the blood dried on his face. We see that face of suffering, the body that seems to get across that idea of suffering. And it's meant to be appalling and humanize these figures, to give you a sense of what Mary might have actually felt, rather than these higher ideals that Mary would have just sat there and accepted that this is what happens. No, she's the mother of Jesus, so she's going to be screaming. She's going to be incredibly upset. Even if she knew this was coming, it's going to be a very upsetting experience. And this attitude towards religious art became increasingly popular, especially in private devotional pieces, this idea of emphasizing the emotion of the piece. So we get this very strong, very emotional piece that's supposed to make you feel the grief that Mary would have felt and feel the suffering, or have a sense of the suffering that Jesus went through leading up to his death.